Hello and welcome to Getting Started with Learning Azure. I'm Joey D'Antoni. I'm going to be the host of the SQL Bits panel. Joining me are going to be my colleagues at Denny Cherry Associates Consulting, John Morehouse and Monica Rathman. Hello and welcome to SQL Bits Virtual 2020. I'm Joey D'Antoni, and today we're going to do a panel discussion on getting started with learning Azure. There are lots of folks who have questions around how do they get started with learning Azure. There are a lot of challenges around that and roadblocks that people face. I'm Joey D'Antoni. I'm principal consultant at Denny Cherry Associates Consulting, and I'm joined by my two colleagues, Monica Rathman and John Morehouse, and we're going to talk today about how to get started with Azure. Hello, John and Monica, and welcome to today's webinar or session.
Hey, guys.
So I have a few seed questions, and then we can just kind of talk from there. And I'll pose this one first to John. I'm a DBA, and my company's moving to Azure VMs. What are the bare minimum things I need to know to keep the lights on?
The bare minimums to keep the lights on?
Yep.
I think from a DBA perspective, one of the things that we have to always keep in mind from a disaster recovery solution is that moving to the cloud doesn't resolve that responsibility. So in short, in order to make sure that we keep the lights on, we still have to plan for a disaster recovery solution, even moving to Azure. And that's really important. And so that means backups, some other secondary node somewhere, use availability groups with Azure or SQL Server on Azure virtual machine, some sort of DR solution.
Mm-hmm. Monica, what are your thoughts on that?
The bare minimum
of
keeping the lights on, right, is one, knowing what you need to migrate up there, right? Are you going to create some VMs? Are you going to use just an Azure SQL DB? Are we going to manage instance? What do you need for your environment, your storage size, how much data you plan on bringing in? You need to know all of that stuff in order to be able to properly set it up. That's going to be your main step to even keeping the lights on, knowing how to get it there, knowing what you need in the cloud in order to do so.
Yeah, I think the two things I always like to tell folks is that like storage and networking are pretty different. The other things are less like SQL Server in a VM, still SQL Server in a VM. You kind of do all the same things, but storage and networking, and to an extent DR. One of the things that's kind of interesting is Azure itself is highly available. So you have, even if you have a single VM, I think they quote 99.9, it might be 99.95% uptime for a single VM. And that can be enough for a lot of organizations, but you should still have a plan in case the data center your resources are in goes away. Monica, you brought up managed instance and Azure SQL DB. Can you explain the differences between those two? And by the way, what the hell is Synapse Analytics?
Synapse Analytics is not a question for me. But the difference between managed instance, a VM, SQL VM, an Azure VM, or a SQL database, managed instance is going to be your closest to on-prem, just like you had an on-prem database, right? Your on-prem server. It's going to be almost the exact type of thing, but you're in Azure and in the cloud. When you go to an Azure VM, that's like you have a VM host, just something, like you have locally now. It's not a lot of difference. You get the OSs there. You get to put a bunch of databases on one VM, just like you're working in your normal environment. It kind of feels the same. Azure SQL DB is totally different. It's just a single database. It's all contained as far as your users are concerned. It's going to be your stepping stone for me is starting off with a small Azure VM. That means a SQL database.
Yeah, I like to tell folks a lot of times, if you're developing a new application from scratch and all of your data lives in the cloud, that's when you want to go with SQL database. Managed instance is kind of a little bit more of a bridge between using an infrastructure as a service solution, a platform as a service solution. Just be aware managed instance takes a long time to deploy. Yes. It's not a bug. That's part of the way they architected the security. John, do you have any comments on that topic?
I think they've improved the deployment time. I was able to deploy a managed instance relatively recently, and it only took a couple hours. So it wasn't the 6-hour window that we always talked about in the past.
They hired more interns.
I think they've definitely made improvements.
Yeah.
I think that organizations and customers really need to evaluate what works best for them. Both Azure SQL Database and managed instance, SQL managed instance are both platforms as a service. So there's pros and cons about both, and we've abstracted away the operating system and the underlying infrastructure, so that's a difference in granular control over that. Mm-hmm. If you need SQL agent, you have to run jobs. Managed instance would be a better fit for that because that's not available in Azure SQL Database. So I think both products are fantastic, especially when moving to the cloud, but they do have unique purposes and will satisfy certain needs. So customers need to evaluate those.
Yeah, and that's something Microsoft really kind of sells as a benefit to those platforms, right? Like, it's not just that they're managing your high availability and your backups, it's that they're managing your patches. And if stuff goes wrong, they're the ones who roll it back. And you don't have to worry about that. That usually happens transparently to you for the most part. And then the final thing to answer my own question about Synapse Analytics. Synapse Analytics is formerly known as Azure Data Warehouse. And if your data is over a few terabytes and you have a real data warehouse, like with facts and dimensions and not just something somebody calls a data warehouse, it can be a good solution for you. It's pricey, so know that up front, but it's a very powerful compute tier.
I think one thing you mentioned, though, you mentioned that the infrastructure, the service provides patches and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's an interesting thing for DBAs in general to kind of let go of. I think we're control hungry by nature. We like to control all the knobs and all the switches, and so relinquishing that control to the service to actually do those patches and whatnot. It's really about what level of granular control are you comfortable with from a DBA perspective or organizational perspective to allow that service to manage that. I think that's an interesting conversation to have with clients as we help them get to the cloud. Your organizational responsibilities are still there. They just kind of shift a little bit. And so I think that's an interesting point to bring up.
Well, especially
that's one of the things that make DBAs kick and scream, right? We want to control our backups. We want to control all of that stuff. And actually relinquishing that as a diehard DBA is scary.
Backups are scary. You can take my patching all day.
Yeah, but backups are harder.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of limited because there are some things, especially with SQL DB, where the restore process can be pretty slow because frankly, it's backed up to slow spinning disk, which is the polite way we call that. And it takes a while to restore. I've had 300 gig databases take a few hours to bring back. That's a little bit improved in managed instance. In a managed instance, you can make copy only backups. You can't really restore them anywhere except to another managed instance, or possibly to a SQL Server 2019, depending on what day of the week and what patch level you're on. But yeah, that is, it's something that I've grown to become accustomed to. But yeah, for sure. Just a fun point of trivia, the original SQL Azure didn't have backups at all.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
There has never been a backup command in Azure SQL Database, but they just didn't have backups. All you could do would be take a backpack to protect your database. That was the only
That
option.
would have stopped me from going.
A backpack would not be a backup, in my opinion.
No, so just to give you an idea of the first SQL database, I think the size limits were 1 in 3 gig or 1 in 5 gig for business.
I remember those limits back in the day.
Yeah, there was no backups, and there was they use transactional application for high availability. Right now they use either storage or AGs depending on the tier you're on. But yeah, it's come a long way. It was definitely kind of a alpha product at first.
I agree with you that it's definitely come along, because I remember back in the day, they had those size limits.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the day, I would do side work. Years ago. This is 10 years ago. I don't remember, but we would. I actually had a project where they wanted to go to Azure, and they're like, their database was way too big. We couldn't go because there was those size constraints back then. So I've always been impressed with the speed that Microsoft has moved that platform forward and given us better options to actually go to the cloud.
So Monica, how does what are some options for troubleshooting performance with Azure SQL Database?
Oh, well, first of all, you guys should know I've gone kicking and screaming into the cloud. It's not until I've actually gone and played with it, which these guys have been in the cloud much longer than me, that I've actually been able to, really dig into it. And it's been performance and how I dig into Azure SQL databases and the VMs inside the Azure portal. And there's a lot of options there. There's some performance metrics that you can do. There's some automatic tuning, some insights that it gives you. It makes it relatively simple to actually peek in and see how your databases are performing inside Azure. The portal is relatively easy. And you can actually do same performance tuning inside SSMS and easily connect your Azure databases to it and use query store and things like that as well, just like you would with an on-prem database. So it's where I've kind of gotten my tentacles inside Azure and started playing around because like I said, I was one of those kicking and screaming, not wanting to get out there because I love the normal on-prem DBA work like most do, so.
I kind of feel like there are two different sets of experiences there that Microsoft's created. And all of this data really builds on top of the query store. And some of this stuff is in managed instance and some of it's not. And that's just because kind of managed instances security framework doesn't allow all the traffic to other Azure services that SQL database does. But all the data builds on the query store, and Microsoft's aggregating that data. So when you hear about telemetry and things like that, that's the data that's getting aggregated. They've abstracted out any identifying information in your queries, but they're looking at generic queries and performance because they're trying to isolate performance issues over time. And you too can capture that data. So we have a customer where we're actually archiving all of their query store data, and aggregating it into kind of a data warehouse. But we're also using I think it's called diagnostic information that you log, and you have a few options where you can log it. You can log it to blob storage where it's stored as an extended event file, or you can log it to Azure Log Analytics where you get this really cool dashboard called Intelligent Insights. And I think that's something that, especially when you aggregate a bunch of that data, is really useful. And you can kind of see all like the metrics Microsoft's capturing. John, do you have any comments on that?
I think Query Store is one of the many great features that Microsoft has developed over time. I absolutely love that it's enabled by default with Azure SQL Database, right? So as we gain new customers and they're in the cloud already, we already have those metrics in place. We don't have to go enable it. We don't have to, unless somebody has gone and like actually turned it off.
Yeah.
It's already present there. So I think Query Store is very valuable in performance tuning in both on-premises and in Azure SQL. So I think that's a great solution to have.
It's kind of it's really kind of interesting just to see how like almost every new feature added to SQL Server since 2012 has been kind of for Azure reasons, like to ultimately support SQL Azure. And there are some other exceptions. There are some exceptions to that, but by and whole, that's the case. John, question for you: what do you describe high availability in Azure and how it's implemented?
So high availability is ensuring that your SQL Server, your databases are up, the largest uptime possible, just like it would be on premises. On premises, we would do availability groups, or in the day we would do mirroring or some other fashion to facilitate, or clustering to facilitate that high availability. Thankfully, with Azure and the way that they have architected it, there's a couple different options depending on what platform you go to. You can use availability groups with a SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machine. But the storage that is used behind the scenes with all those products have baked in high availability. I think if you use like locally redundant storage, which means that the storage is locally redundant within that data center, like you get 11 nines, I think, out of the box.
That is correct. I read that.
Is that right? Okay, cool. Yeah, so that means like what, milliseconds worth of downtime a year or something? I mean, I don't know what the number is.
That specific guarantee is more around the durability, I think, than the downtime, is my understanding. Like it's an 11.
Okay, so still that's pretty durable,
but like even a VM is 99.95, I think, a single VM by itself, just the platform, and that's, I don't remember that downtime off the top of my head, but it's not terrible.
I think it's 3 nines. So you like 8 hours of downtime a year.
Yeah.
Which is still good. I mean, I remember back in the day when the cloud didn't exist and we had a lot longer outages than 8 hours at times because the array would go down for some strange reason, right? The server says, see ya, I'm out. So in high availability with Azure, a lot of that stuff is baked into the product itself. Right, if you go to certain tiers, it's baked in automatically. Managed instance, if you go to the business critical tier, you get the high availability automatically out of the box. With Azure SQL Database, you can use automatic failover groups to obtain some of that high availability from that's disaster recovery. Sorry, that's disaster recovery.
Yeah. Everything kind of in Azure, I think they're required to architect it in a highly available fashion out of the box. So like that's something
which I think is smart.
Yeah, and that's something a lot of people don't account for when they talk about cost, because Azure SQL database looks like it's a lot more expensive than, say, maybe having a SQL server and a VM, but you're getting high availability. You're getting backups. It's insanely
for that price.
Yeah. And you don't have to
I agree.
configure any of it.
I think one of the best things about Azure is the high availability and the disaster recovery that you can set up and you can switch from one coast of the United States to the other coast really, really quickly. You cannot do that on-prem. You have to wait for all the hardware to be created. You got to get a data center someplace else. Your one data center could be too close to another data center, and Azure just solves all of that very, very easily.
I agree.
That's a very good point. I mean, I think that's something a lot of people don't necessarily think about, but trying to distribute hardware between data centers, even like when I was at Comcast, and it's a big company, and we bought servers by the truckload, but getting all the same hardware in the same data centers and knowing you're going to have a similar experience is so much easier. And we were Comcast, and that was hard for us to do. If you're a small company, getting a second or third data center is practically impossible.
There's several places that have inadequate DR just because they don't have the ability to have the same size machine in both places. I mean, that's a huge, huge capital investment to have that kind of infrastructure set up. It's not so much in Azure.
And I think we're spoiled now, right? So if you're well, we are, right? Who remembers back in the day when you were going to upgrade a server or even stand up a new server? It was a 4-month process, right? You had to do the quote, you had to get the hardware, you had to plug in all the cards, plug in the array. It was literally a 4-month process. And by the time you did that, the tech was outdated anyways.
Yeah.
And you had to beg for the budget.
Now we can spin up pretty big virtual machines within 10 minutes, 15 minutes.
I did a 50 terabyte migration last month. It was Azure to Azure, right? So they were already in Azure and it was just moving to a new VM class. 50 terabytes of data. We started on a Thursday. They were live on Saturday night.
That's impressive.
With no real downtime.
We as DBAs were spoiled.
Yeah,
and that's incredible, right?
Yeah.
And so that's also one of the that also highlights one of the benefits about Azure is the Microsoft backbone, right? And I remember we had a client in the UK, and we had to move data around, and so we actually used the Azure backbone to facilitate that because it was a hell of a lot faster than doing it over FTP or my local internet provider. And so that made a world of difference utilizing that backbone that Microsoft has built.
You brought up another interesting point that I just want to touch on before my next question. You mentioned cost with DR, and I think one of the things and size of machines, and I think one of the things that's really interesting in a DR scenario, almost always you're going to have some level of downtime, right? When we talk about high availability, we talk about like synchronous things and that we can automatically fail over and there's zero data loss in that kind of scenario. With DR, you're going to lose a little bit of data inherently. That's part of the process. Somebody's usually going to have to manually start something up unless you're, error handling is really good. So typically in a DR scenario, you're willing to take some downtime, which means you can save a lot of money and size those DR machines at, maybe 25% of the size of what your production machines are. So your compute costs are a lot less. Monica, question for you. What are your thoughts around saving money in the cloud and not leaving your Synapse Analytics workspace on for like 12 hours? Monica hasn't done this. I don't want to sound like I'm accusing her of having done that.
No, but there's a lot of ways you can waste money as well as save money, right? So we've all been there where we've got a bill and been like, oh no. No, but there's lots of different ways. There's a new option that's a serverless option for Azure SQL DB. And that one allows the system to pause for you. So you're not being charged for compute at all. You're just being charged for the storage during downtime. That's a great way to solve it. You can scale up and scale down your machines very, very quickly. And you can even automate that during downtimes if you have a set schedule. There's lots of different ways to save money in Azure. And you can scale up when you really need stuff, right? You can't do that with the home hardware, on-prem. But I could scale it up during my busy months if I'm an accountant, and I can scale it up at the beginning near tax season, and then I could scale it down and save money for the rest of the year. Lots of different things you can do in the cloud.
Yeah, I feel like the serverless thing is really powerful because it's it's the first time we've ever had anything with SQL Server where it had any semblance of an auto scale. I would like the restart ability to be cleaned up a little bit. I ran into some issues with that at a customer this week, and I don't know if I mentioned this to you guys on chat because I was playing with it this morning. It turns out one of the things you can do to wake up an Azure SQL database in serverless is request its TDE status, transparent data encryption, for if you don't know. And I was having issues getting my first connection to work at all and to wake the serverless database, and just doing the PowerShell commandlet to get the TDE status of the database, which happens kind of external to the database itself. It happens like at the Azure control plane. Seems to have worked. So FYI tip, if you're trying to do automation, I'll write a blog post about that. Touch the database from Azure. You could also, I think there was something else you could do, like turn auditing on and off, or add a tag, and this would all restart the database. John, any tips for cost savings? Or go ahead.
Can't you pause today? Well, I know I thought in the Azure Data Warehouse you could pause that.
Azure Data Warehouse you can. Serverless you can't pause and restart. Although I may have emailed the product team this morning and asked them for a flag on a commandlet to do just that.
Right. So that's one of the differences, though, right? The Azure Data Warehouse, you could manually pause it, whereas Azure SQL Database, the service controlled when that paused and when it fired back up, right?
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and Azure Analysis Services can also be paused and restarted. We have one of the things I built for a customer that was really clever and really hacky at the same time was they have a customer who they have a kind of a data as a service platform, and they have a customer who's on Azure Analysis Services, which is pretty expensive because it requires a lot of memory for the VMs. And the one customer wasn't enough to make the service profitable for them if it ran 24/7. So we created a logic app so that the customer can send an email that says start cube, and it will start the cube. Then the cube and the logic app runs an automation runbook, and Rube Goldberg comes into play. And then the cube starts. So that was pretty cool. They can also stop it, but otherwise it just stops at like 8 o'clock at night. So
that's cool.
John, question about your thoughts on backups across the platform. Obviously for SQL database, there are fewer concerns because we're not managing them, but there are still some things you can do, like around long-term. And I just take your thoughts on how you approach backing up, and both in Azure VM and handling backups and platform as a service offerings.
So one of the things I really like about, and this kind of goes back to my comment about granular control. It is kind of nice as a DBA that at least platform as a service, I don't have to worry about the backups. Like I have to account for the restore time. And like you, I had to restore a database for a client, and it was a relatively small database. I think it was 90 gigs, so it wasn't huge by any means, but it took a couple hours for that to restore. Mm-hmm. And so you have to take that into account from a disaster recovery solution. But I like that I don't have to worry about, as soon as my customer puts a new database into the environment, mm-hmm. I don't have to worry about a backup being taken. It's done automatically. I know out of the box, with no long-term retention configured, I've got it for 7 days, and I can do a point-in-time restore if I wanted to. And then thankfully, most clients have some sort of long-term retention set up. Obviously, they pay for that through storage, but we can keep those backups for up to 10 years for audit needs. I really like that, as that's baked into the product. You get that right out of the box. Mm-hmm. There's no other, you don't have to configure anything. You don't have to remember, oh, we set up that server, but we never configured backups, mm-hmm. which we've probably all been there, where a client stands up a new server and forgets to tell you about it. We don't have to worry about that with the backup process. Mm-hmm. Now, I do think that like SQL Server on an Azure virtual machine, I still like to use the native tools that we've kind of come accustomed to, like Ola Hologren's suite of things. Mm-hmm. I know that there's some options from a platform perspective where it'll take like a snapshot, like a VSS snapshot. I've had mixed results with that, so I still tend to stick with, I'm going to manage those backups like I would on premises and use the native backup process to control those backups.
Yeah, one of the things I think a lot of people do that I don't like, especially who are new to Azure, when they're in a VM, I still do use all this code, but you have a couple of options. You can back up to the local file system. I really like to use backup to URL. That's some functionality, if you're not familiar with it, that's been in SQL Server since 2012, where you back up directly to Azure Blob Storage. And I typically have a job step after my backup that goes and runs some PowerShell to clean up older backups after the backup's successful. The next thing I'm going to say, and I want both of your opinions on this, is that you should never actually back up your VMs in Azure. You should just back up your data.
Is your backup of the VM intended to be a recovery point for the data, the database itself?
I think that's a good question to ask. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand, especially infrastructure managers, don't understand how database backups work or database disaster recovery works in a lot of cases. So go ahead, Monica.
Isn't it quicker just to spin up another VM and throw your data over to it rather than backing up your VM yourself?
Ding, 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 ding.
Right. So there's no use, in my opinion, to do that unless you have some very special configuration or something that you've done for that particular implementation. But to me, I would be like, oh, I'm not sure about that.
Well, so realistically, one of the things you should know about Azure, and is important to know, that everything is stored in a resource template that's a JSON document that gets created, because all of Azure is just a bunch of JavaScript.
True.
And so you can source control all of your Azure resources as code. And then where it gets a little messy is if you have configurations like an availability group, that can all be configured as PowerShell and T-SQL and stored in source control as well. It's a little bit harder to like automatically deploy that. One of the things I think you'll learn as you learn more about Azure, for those of you watching this, is it's really easy to do stuff to Azure resources. It's really hard to do stuff within those resources. Like, it's really easy to deploy a bunch of databases from a PowerShell script or deploy a bunch of VMs. It's really hard to go inside of those and do stuff, because then you have to go into that next layer. And that's where you start to talk about like desired state configuration. So question for Monica, do you see value in studying for and attaining Azure certifications, since we're talking about learning Azure? And I'm not sure if you have any.
I don't have any Azure certifications yet. But there's always, to me, good, especially if you're going to next job levels, to have those certifications and to show that you're continually growing and that you're embracing the latest technology in Azure. It's kind of a hot thing right now. There's always an argument whether certifications are worth it, not worth it, or whatever. But I'm on the pro certification. And especially now, if you're on LinkedIn and you're on all of those things and you are looking for a job in the next year or two, showing those, especially when you're going into something that's a little more innovative, a place that's a little more innovative, I think is important.
Yeah, John, your thoughts on that?
I agree with what Monica said. The other thing I would add is I think that the way that Microsoft has kind of shifted those certifications, because now they expire, right? It's what, a two-year rotation?
2 years, I believe.
It's a year or two. I don't remember what the rotation cycle is, but you now have to retake those exams to stay current on the new technology. And we all know that Microsoft, kind of moves at ludicrous speed when shifting things. So I like that you have to retake those exams to stay current. And that means if I see people's certifications, they've at least stayed current with the technology that's out there today.
And I think it forces you to learn things that you might not learn on your own playing around with Azure, especially myself playing around. I've learned different facets of it. But when you take those exams or study for those exams, you have to get into the networking. You have to get into all of the setup, all the HADR that might not have been in your realm of what you normally work on. And it forces you to learn. And that, I think that's one of the biggest benefits of taking the test.
That was a really great response, because it leads into my next question. What are the, and I'll just put it to both of you, and John first, what are the non-core things? Like, we're not talking about SQL in a VM, we're not talking about SQL DB or managed instance or data warehouse or Synapse or whatever we're calling it this week, that like you feel are really helpful to know in Azure and useful to you as as a DBA, I guess.
So even as a DBA, and I was, when I did the primarily on premises work, I was still that DBA that would go talk to the SAN admins, go talk to the network people, kind of got my hands into that. But for me personally, the networking side of Azure was a huge hurdle for me, because it's slightly different, I think. And I don't come from a very strong networking background, but you have to learn some of that to know how the products talk to each other, how you talk to your on-premise products, how the logic app talks and all that, how that all communicates and comes together and is done in a way that is secure, right? We're now moving our customer data or our organizational data away from our secure Fort Knox data center we might sit next to Microsoft's environment. So we have to make sure that's done in a secure manner and secure as possible without, obviously causing performance issues or anything else. And for me, understanding that networking and how it all works was a big hurdle, and I still learn every day. And hell, half the time I'm talking to you going, hey, how does this work? Because I don't fully understand the networking background. So that for me, that was one of the big components I had to get my head around.
When you guys talk about that stuff, I hear Charlie Brown's teacher talking. And that's one of the biggest things that I've had to do, because I'm like you. I would turn over to the network admin, hey, I need a new VM set up. I need this, I need that. I need it to be able to talk to this and everything set up. And I'd say, here, this is my specs, return it back to me. And then I took off with the SQL stuff. You can't do that. Now you're setting up the SQL VM. You've got to set that up from start to finish. The security piece, all the network piece, domain controllers. Who would have thought I'd have to set up domain controllers and all of that kind of stuff in order to deal with SQL Server? But it's totally different. And that is a huge change in thought and learning pattern for me.
And your thoughts on scripting and how you need to know that, starting with Monica, who's a big fan of PowerShell.
So everybody jokes me because I'm allergic to PowerShell. Like, I break out in hives. I hate PowerShell. I love what it does. And I love DBA tools and all that kind of stuff. It does some really great things, but actually diving in and doing PowerShell and understanding the commandlets is not what I love. Going to Azure, it's a requirement. So there's a lot. And sometimes I turn over to the guys, hey, I need a script that does this, so they can kick me what they have and I can just change just a little bit and get running.
Except you broke my script.
I'm sorry, I broke a script. Yes, I did. I broke a script.
It took Rob Zillan.
Yes.
2 days.
Yeah, we had to get Rob on the phone to try to get it to work after we broke it. But yes, so that's another thing. Besides the networking, it's starting to get into the scripting languages and having to go into PowerShell kicking and screaming. Again, great thing. I know how to use it now. Whether I want to still be using it and writing it is two different stories. But with Azure,
the specific scenario that Monica encountered, and it was something I developed initially, was to be able to run a SQL script on every database in an Azure subscription. And then for Monica's customer, we had to modify it to run a script against every SQL database in a tenant across multiple subscriptions. And unfortunately, there was some bad data handling by Microsoft on certain types of subscriptions, and we had to do a little bit of a workaround. But yeah, PowerShell is really a requirement. One of the kind of interesting things is SQL or Azure SQL database doesn't have a SQL agent. So if you want to run scheduled tasks, you have a few options, but one of them is Azure Automation, and your only option there is PowerShell or Python. But I've never actually seen a Python automation run book. And I'll start with John. What are some resources as to how you got started with learning Azure besides just diving in, or did you just dive in?
So I was thankful enough that several years ago I realized that the cloud's not a fad. I know that we still hear that and we joke about that we still hear, oh, the cloud's a fad. It's going to be around, and it definitely has shifted to the DBA platform. And we all should learn something about the cloud. And really, I kind of joined DCAC because I wanted to play more in the cloud, and the company has offered me to do that, or has allowed me to do that. And so really, I kind of just jumped in. I did buy some networking books because I knew that was an aspect of Azure that I didn't really understand. And so I bought some books and tried to read and play around with things. Thankfully, I think the Azure, even the free credits that you can get, or the $200 credit you can get for free right off the bat to spend for 30 days. You can find ways and avenues to play around and test things. And so that's one of the things I did too. Is okay, let's go stand up an Azure SQL database. How does that work? What are all the knobs and buttons that you can push and configure? And so trial and error was another way that I kind of learned things. Hey, let's try to go break that and see what happens.
Not on a client environment, though.
Not on a client environment. Well, only if they have one of my clients is a dev environment.
Or the client asked me to try to do something.
Yes, that happens too.
This might break stuff.
Yeah, but if you do it in a dev environment, yes, I can restore the database. Might take an hour or two, but I can restore it. I can fix it.
Monica, your thoughts on that?
So definitely getting the test account for sure. So you won't learn until you touch stuff, right? And then you figure out that you're supposed to turn something off when you're done with it so it doesn't waste all your money. That was a hard lesson to learn. But also Bob and Anna, so Bob Ward and Anna Kaufman have a great 62 series, 62 video series you can start from start to beginning, start to finish on Azure. And they're only like 2 minutes long each segment. I think one might be 5 minutes. Putting that on while I'm working and kind of catching things and glancing over and stuff like that, or maybe during a lunch break, fantastic stuff. And of course, I sit in your guys' sessions on SQL Saturdays and Summit and all of that kind of stuff, sitting into sessions and trying to learn something new. But if we were starting out now and you needed to get some online training or whatever, Bob and Anna's videos are great.
Yeah, and I think additionally, Microsoft has some like not trial accounts like John was talking about, but there's some new like test labs where you can like go into a subscription and do some stuff. The one thing I'll like caveat those with, like the Bob and Anna stuff is fantastic. The test accounts, you're not necessarily in full control of the subscription, which might be fine if you're trying to like learn Azure SQL database. That's not a big deal. You don't need to be in full control. But being in full control, I feel like allows you to encounter some complex scenarios that you might not otherwise encounter. One of the things that I think is really important to know is Azure Active Directory, because it's the point of authorization and access control for Azure, and specifically with Azure SQL Database and MI. That's what we need to do. And there's a lot of complexity around, especially when you're acting as a managed identity and dealing with automation and how some of that stuff works. John, did you have a story there? You seem to pop up when I talked about AAD.
Yeah, because to be honest, when I started working with the cloud, I just figured that AAD was the same as AD on premises, and that's not the case, right? It's different. It's a different beast, and it functions differently. Yes, you can sync the two, right? You can do the Active Directory sync, but it functionally it's different. And so that was kind of mind blowing when, I think it was you that told me that, or somewhere I learned that along the way, that those aren't identically the same. They're functionally different. They still serve authentication purposes, but it's different. And so I had to get my mind wrapped around that. And again, I'm not a domain admin per se. I know enough about Active Directory to be dangerous probably. And so taking that knowledge up to the cloud was just another hurdle I had to get around to understand how Azure Active Directory works.
So that's another question, because I don't play with it as much as you guys do. As a regular DBA, is that something I really need to learn, or am I still going to have an admin that's able to set that up?
So here's where it's complicated. Creating users and creating users is almost exactly the same. Instead of from Windows, you say from external provider. And you have to put in, you would say Joey at dcac.com and not dcac/Joey. Where it gets tricky is what we call service principals. So one of the things I ran into, and this is something that's pretty new, it's really hard in an automation context to log in to an Azure SQL database as an AAD user. I went down this rabbit hole a few weeks ago, and the issue was we wanted to create an Azure Active Directory user in the context of an automation runbook in an Azure SQL database. So in the runbook, we were creating the user in AAD. That works fine. We wanted to add that user to the Azure SQL database. In order to do that, you have to log in as Azure SQL, as an Azure Active Directory account. Joey at dcac.com can add Monica at dcac.com to the database. However, in the context of a runbook, that got really tricky. And I ended up having to, this is some pretty new functionality. You create a service principal for each of your Azure databases, which is like the Azure Active Directory equivalent of a service account. You give it a specific permission so it can read AD, and then it can log in and create that user account dynamically. So yeah, that's kind of painful. Even though like my automation account had the permissions to do all that, and it's my automation account that it's logging into the database, I still have to give my SQL database the permission as needed. So yeah, you can quickly get down a rabbit hole, as I just described.
I think you could get down a rabbit hole with on-premises Active Directory.
Yeah.
Organizational units and all that stuff and how that all works. I think the cloud just
how many times have we fought the dreaded Kerberos double hop error?
I don't even.
We've all run into that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think those are all kind of like challenges, and it's funny. They're similar challenges to what you face on prem. They're just different, right? Uh, we're almost out of time. John, do you have any final parting thoughts before I go to Monica?
I would definitely recommend for DBAs, if you're watching this, that if you haven't started to play around or at least have some knowledge around the cloud, I definitely recommend that everybody kind of start doing it. As I mentioned before, it's not a fad. It's going to be around, probably around for quite some time. The cloud isn't for everybody. We do have some organizations where on-premises makes more sense, but the cloud is very powerful and can help boost your local ecosystem and maybe give you better performance. So definitely take a look at the cloud. I highly recommend Microsoft Azure, but there are multiple cloud providers out there. But I like Azure. That's the one I choose.
Monica?
I think if you're one of the ones kicking and screaming, sooner or later you're going to land there.
That's a good point.
Everybody's still afraid, they're going to lose their DBA job or whatever. Me, I don't live in the cloud all the time, but I'm using it. Even if it's not part of my normal job, I performance tune for many clients, and they still are part of Azure. So there's still a lot of performance tuning stuff you have to learn. Query Store is still there. You can still do a bunch of that in your normal environment using SSMS or Azure Data Studio. All of that stuff is still going to feel familiar to you. You're still going to feel at home in there. You just got to click a few different places and connect a little bit differently. You can still use the cloud without kicking and screaming. You're going to be there. You're going to get there. It's inevitable.
Yeah. To John's point, you mentioned something I don't think we've touched on. This is a Microsoft-sponsored conference, so we're very Azure-centric. One of the things I think about is you should try to, and I always tell this to folks when I'm teaching them, you should try to learn one platform first before you learn the other. Whether that one platform be AWS or Azure, Google Cloud. Once you learn one, architecturally, they're all not that different. There are little nuances that make them different, like especially around how you handle networking for availability groups. That seems to be unique with each cloud provider. However, in general, the architectural concepts they have are very, very similar. There was one other point I wanted to make there, and I'm forgetting. Azure. This is my pitch for Azure. If you're running Microsoft SQL Server workloads, it makes sense to run on the cloud with the vendor who owns the source code for Microsoft SQL Server.
Agreed.
There are some licensing benefits and other stuff, and Microsoft has some benchmarks where they say, SQL Server runs 0.003% faster on an Azure VM, which is mostly crap. But like when you start dealing with platform as a service offerings like SQL DB or MI, you get a lot of benefits that you won't get if you're running, say, Amazon RDS. So I think there's a lot of benefit in being with the vendor who owns the software. Well, thank you, everyone. This is great. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll answer any questions in the chat afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining.